What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're going to be diving in and breaking down the Lions' two most recent coaching hirings, and one of them is a former Detroit Lion. Welcome everybody to a video. Glad you guys are here. And yes, today we're talking about the two most recent additions to the Lions coaching staff, and I'm sure more of this will pop up as we go through the offseason, so stay tuned. Now, this is likely not breaking news. You've probably seen these coaching hirings announced, so that's not what this video necessarily is, because you've probably seen it. Maybe not. Maybe it's your first time. Well, now it is breaking news, but it's probably not. So today what we're doing is diving into these coaches specifically, their background, what they've done, and what I believe they'll bring to the table, and also on top of that, what is their role going to be for the Lions, and how does that affect the guys around them. So that's what this video is for. It's not really breaking news. It's more so to just break down these players. Now, quick side note, I do plan on being live tomorrow for the Senior Bowl to react to the Senior Bowl, talk about the players that are participating, talk some draft, really talk whatever. So if you guys want to catch me live, then I'm likely going to be live tomorrow for the Senior Bowl. So just for anybody that's maybe interested in that. But back to the video. We're going to dive into these two guys. One of them, unfortunately, I did not get to see play. He's a little bit before my time. I was alive, but a lot of you guys did get to see him play. And I know that drew a lot of hype from what I've seen within the Lions community, because a lot of you did see him play in a short stint with the Detroit Lions. And then again, the other coaching hiring was also a former player, another player that I did not see play live. So I'll try not to spend too much time on their their playing backgrounds. I'll touch on it, give you a background of it, but not too much time on, what type of player they were and that kind of thing, because I didn't get to see these guys play. I'll focus more on, what they've done really since that time. So with that, let's dive right into it, and let's start with the former Detroit Lion. It's also the most recent coaching hiring, I believe, announced, depending on when you're watching this video, and that is Dre Bly. Yes, Dre Bly. He was a 3-year player for the Detroit Lions, very short stint, but in that stint, he was a 2-time Pro Bowler. So let's go back a little bit. One thing that I found that was pretty interesting with Dre Bly that just kind of stood out to me was his size for a cornerback that was productive as he was. Now, there's no issue with this, but it definitely made me think of Aaron Glenn, who was also known as an undersized cornerback, only under 6 foot tall, that was extremely productive in the NFL. That's kind of the same case here with Dre Bly as well, and it may have been part of the reason that he wasn't ultimately a first-round pick, because statistically in college, he was incredible. He had incredible production, but the measurables, 5'9", 180 some pounds, 4'5", 140, 35-inch vertical jump, like that kind of thing can lead you to maybe not being a first-round pick, not necessarily having those tools. But in the NFL, statistically, he had an incredible career, just like he did at North Carolina back in college. I mean, he burst onto the scene in his redshirt freshman season with 11 interceptions. He finished his career with North Carolina with 20 interceptions, which at the time set the record for most interceptions in that conference. It would later be broken. He was also the only 2-time All-American player. He was named that as a redshirt freshman, so the numbers were outstanding there. Now, that led him to being a second-round pick by the St. Louis Rams, and he didn't see a ton of starts with the St. Louis Rams, specifically in his first 3 seasons, yet in those first 3 seasons, he still notched 12 interceptions, 14 in his first 4 years with St. Louis. Then, of course, he would have ended his rookie contract. He signed with the Detroit Lions. He was with the Lions for 4 seasons. He was ultimately then traded by the Lions, but still in those 4 seasons, talk about outstanding production, he became a Detroit Lion, basically became a full-time starter with the Detroit Lions, and put up 19 interceptions, 65 passes defended according to Pro Football Reference. He was then traded away for an offensive tackle, a running back, and a 5th-round pick to the Denver Broncos, and pretty productive there as well. And then he finished up his career with the San Francisco 49ers and back with the Lions on a short stint, but I don't believe he actually even played with the Lions a second time around. He began his coaching career back at the youth and high school levels. Okay, that's where he started off. He was a high school coach in Charlotte, and he was also a youth coach, I believe, for baseball as well at the time. And then he said he kind of dove into his contacts, and he ended up getting basically 2 internships. He worked as an intern with the Miami Dolphins and also with the New Orleans Saints. I believe he was part of the NFL Diversity Fellowship, which potentially helped him get some of those internships. Now, there is a clear connection here between Glenn Campbell and Dre Bly. He said he's, kind of stayed, I guess, in touch with Aaron Glenn, but that's back in 2017 when he was the intern with the New Orleans Saints. Dan Campbell would have been the assistant head coach after being with the Dolphins, and Aaron Glenn was the defensive backs coach. What stands out to me here is where he talks about being able to connect with the players, as we'll see by the recruiting background, definitely has that, and then being able to show the players, not just tell them. And he's specifically the cornerbacks coach, not secondary, he's a cornerbacks coach, and of course, being a former cornerback, we'll talk about what he's done in the past, you would assume that he's going to do a really good job at that. Then you move forward to 2018, and very short stint. I believe it was like 2 months. He was with the San Diego Fleet as a cornerbacks coach. So that's what he was named as. They did play in 2019. Mike Marsh was their head coach, but he was only there for 2 months before later being then basically hired by North Carolina, which of course, as we just mentioned, that's where he played. So he was brought in by North Carolina, and apparently the head coach, Mac Brown, had this guy on his radar. Like, this wasn't just, okay, we're getting a guy that played here. Like, this was something that he felt like was part of going to be turning around North Carolina, because North Carolina, before he got there, was having some rough seasons. They had 2 really rough seasons before he got there. Stuck there all the way until now recently being hired by the Detroit Lions, as basically a month ago they mutually agreed to part ways. Take a look at his time with North Carolina. I thought this was interesting. I tried to look at some of their games, looked at 2020 against NC State. Definitely looked like a pretty heavy man press type of team, but and I'm assuming, there's probably connections on how Aaron Glenn wants to play this thing. He always likes to hire guys within his, what does he say, within his ballpark, I guess, the guys that kind of come from the same type of tree. So I would assume schematically that it makes tons of sense here. But there was a lot of things that stood out to me within his time with North Carolina. So I put some of the stats and things like that on the left side of the screen. And you can see Bateman, who was their defensive coordinator originally there when he first landed with North Carolina, that was kind of known for running his 3-4 front, that would try to get pressure in many different ways, kind of disguise pressure, but obviously do it with the least amount of players that he could. But he wanted to be aggressive. Now, unfortunately, it never really necessarily panned out that way with North Carolina. Like, their disruptive rates weren't ever really that high. However, they were good on third down, and they were good at getting sacks. All right, so that was the case. And they did kind of turn things around in the sense that North Carolina was kind of known before Dre Bly got there. Not to say this was all Dre Bly, but just to put it in perspective, before he got there, their Achilles heel was kind of just defensively, they couldn't stop teams. And in the first 2 years that he was with North Carolina, you see the numbers, 2019 to 2020, as a passing defense, ranked in the top half of the nation. And they definitely took some steps up in terms of coverage. 2019, 60% completion percentage, 229 yards a game, 1.4 touchdowns to 1.1 interceptions, and only 308 points. So 2019 and 2020, statistically, as a team, was pretty good. Patrice Rene, who was one of their cornerbacks, as you can see there by that quote saying the cornerback guru, I thought that was the first thing that stuck out to me, just reading on what the players thought of Dre Bly as their cornerbacks coach. He said he called him the cornerback guru. He said he's helped us a lot with how schematically they're asking us to play things, but mainly with the technique side. He was helping them with the technical side because obviously Dre Bly gets that. There are a lot of former players, and if you remember, Aubrey Pleasant's background as a player was a safety in college, so it wasn't a cornerback position necessarily, and on top of that, the Lions could use that with a lot of the youth that they have. Maybe just a guy that just his specialty is that. I also put Land Tony Grimes. So what is this? Well, he was named in 2022 the ACC Recruiter of the Year, which I believe was 24/7 Sports that put that out every season. And landed Tony Grimes, who was one of the top recruits that North Carolina's ever landed. The second highest ranked player that they've ever landed at North Carolina, and he chose to go there over schools like Texas A&M, Georgia, and Ohio State. And Tony Grimes was quoted saying that Ohio State was defensive back U, which, as we kind of know, they put out a lot of defensive backs. Of course, our Jeff Okudah, Marshawn Lattimore, Eli Apple. Yeah, I mean, you can go down the board. There's tons of guys that have played cornerback at that school and have come out and been high draft picks. But the fact that he chose North Carolina over that apparently had a lot to do with Dre Bly, and there was a lot of credit that he was given for what he was as a recruiter, his interaction with players. He was also noted for being involved of, also acquiring players like 5-star offensive tackle Zach Rice, George Pettaway, Chapman, and Holloway, committing to UNC, and also Marcus Allen as a big-time recruit who chose to go to UNC once again, over Georgia. And this is the quote actually from Patrice Rene, who I was discussing, and this is what he said. He said, once he got here, obviously he hadn't coached at that level before, but I think he's done a really good job. He understands his role on the team. He's our corner coach, and he does a really good job at that and coaching us in terms of technique and how to do things scheme-wise. He said, Coach Bly, he's really just a corner guru. He knows everything about the position, and he's elevated my game so much for just the short amount of time he has been with me. This was Grimes' quote saying, I feel like a lot of people say that he's got no coaching experience in college, but I think he's going to be good. I think he knows what he's doing. So that was Grimes, who again was that top recruit that they brought in. This was Dre Bly speaking about kind of the recruiting that he had been a part of there. He said, I feel like I bring a different element to coaching because of the things that I've been able to do. I can pick up my phone and call many different guys. The brotherhood that we share, the fact that those guys are rooting for me, the fact that those guys want to see more of us coaching because we feel like we we have so much to offer. I just utilize it, man. He was credited for back in 2019 when they allowed 10 less points per game as a team than the year before in his first season really there, because he was hired in 2018, but it was the end of 2018. But in 2019, you could see that there was a game that was specifically brought up when reading about him, that DeAndre Hollins was forced to play on the outside against Duke. Hollins had been switched to playing the nickel role. This was a very smart player off the field that was looking for an opportunity, and the coach went basically to Dre Bly and said, hey man, we got to get this guy ready and see if we can pop him to the outside cornerback. It turned out that due to injuries during that Duke game, and they were so thin at outside cornerback, they had to throw him into outside corner, and he was prepared. And as their head coach said, Mac Brown, he's never seen anything like that really before. And that was one of those things that, as a Lions fan, we know situations pop up like that all the time where you have to move pieces. This is a great example. The week before, they had so many injuries. They were hit with a big-time injury bug that season, and that's the things that the big-time numbers don't really tell you, because everything goes into the big numbers, you know, as a whole. But it's the little things like that where a week before, if you're following this team, you may know, right? We would know things like that about the Lions, and they had to take a guy who was mainly playing nickel, and he got to prepare to play on the outside the week before against Duke that season. Now, unfortunately, as you can see, as a whole, their defensive statistics kind of began to just fall off a little bit in 2021 and 2022. After the 2021 season, Bateman, who was their defensive coordinator, was fired as their defensive coordinator. Chiswick came in as their next defensive coordinator. They also fired their outside linebacker coach. I would assume part of that was the schematic side, being that he was playing the 3-4, so it's, you know, different schematically. I believe that was a part of it. So they hired a new defensive coordinator. Now, that can lead to issues. We know that when coaching changes happen, sometimes you get guys that move, and as you can see, Duck, Grimes, Balfour, Brown, they all entered the transfer portal. As you can see, the stats as a whole defensively, again, took a step back. Grimes, who in his career had 19 pass defended and an interception in 3 years, which isn't bad statistically, he also entered the transfer portal, and then again, they mutually agreed to part ways. So that could definitely be a part of it. Like, okay, we're kind of retooling this thing defensively, so maybe that's part of it. And again, for him, just playing that position, the schematic side, I'm going to definitely buy that it's going to fit with what Aaron Glenn's going to want to do. The style definitely looked like it did with all the press man I saw them playing. So hopefully the technical side, they can see some leaps there in just terms of the players individually. And I would assume that guys like Brian Duker and Addison Lynch probably just take on a bigger role after the season. They probably get more added to the title because they held it down in the second half, and we know statistically we were very good. Big part of that was just getting Jerry Jacobs back and other guys like John Kaminsky's and things like that. But in saying that, it would be beneficial to have that, especially if you go out and draft another young guy this year. Maybe that leads to connections potentially within the draft as well. Now, the second coaching hiring that we have, a little bit different, but again, once again, a former player here. As you can see, played at South Dakota State. He was a tight end.
And now what he did was very impressive in college. To be drafted in the third round out of South Dakota State, having second really in statistical production there. Only one has had better production from the tight end position to this point. You're talking about a three-time all-conference mentioned player. Very impressive, the type of numbers that he put up: 1,500 yards, 8 touchdowns, over 100 receptions.
And now he's hired as our tight ends coach. He played for the Chargers and Browns. He was a very long tenured Brown. He's one of the longest tenured Browns. He stuck there for a very long time. He was a third-round pick by the Chargers that was ultimately traded to the Cleveland Browns in 2002, ultimately retiring because of neck spurs, and he was worried about his health, so he ended up retiring, and he jumped into the coaching ranks. And you can see in 2012, he began with Concordia as a tight ends coach. That was kind of a weird one to find. I didn't see that listed really in a lot of places, but that's where he started his coaching ranks. And then from there, he was picked up by the Arizona Cardinals as an assistant special teams coach and an assistant tight ends coach. So the most interesting thing that I took away from this hiring of Steve Heiden, hopefully I'm saying his name right. If I'm not, I apologize. But I think the most interesting thing that I took away from this hiring of Steve as the Lions tight end coach is, again, we talk about always on the defensive side of the ball, kind of being in our ballpark, coming from the same kind of idea of how we want to do things defensively. Well, that really feels like the case here with this type of hiring. All right, this one was kind of weird trying to figure out, his background, because the weirdest thing was from 2013 to 2017, he was the assistant tight ends coach with the Arizona Cardinals. But in 2018, he became the assistant offensive line coach, which definitely felt like, wait, how the heck did that transition even happen? How do you go from assistant tight end coach to assistant offensive line coach? Well, one thing, as you can see on the bottom, 2018, Steve Wilkes became their head coach for one season. Then in 2019, it was Cliff Kingsbury, and he was their head coach for the rest of the way. So basically, he did survive 2 head coaching changes there. He just basically changed positions when Bruce Arians left. Now, part of this is he got to work with Rick Christophel, Again, hopefully I say his name right. He was the tight ends coach, the same tight ends coach the entire time that he was there. When he transitioned to being the assistant offensive line coach, he first off worked behind Ray Brown, who was a former offensive lineman, and then Sean Kruger, who recently, I believe, has been fired with some off-the-field issues. But Sean Kruger, when he was there, he was an offensive line coach and the run game coordinator. So to me, at first I think, look, could he be on the run game side with Deuce Staley being fired? I don't think so. But we also know that we still have our tight ends coach in Tanner Engstrand. He was a tight ends coach last year. He didn't go anywhere. However, my kind of thought to this, and it would not shock me, is if Tanner Engstrand potentially added the title of running backs coach. The Lions could still go out of house and do it. There's the potential now that Tanner Engstrand could get the title of running backs coach with Deuce Staley having left, because he does have that background with the DC Defenders in 2020 and also in San Diego when he was the offensive coordinator there as well. So he has that in his toolbox where you could potentially open that up. This is the hiring, and he's taking the tight end coaching role from what we understand. And you have Tanner Engstrand, who is a pass game coordinator, and we'll have to figure that out on the defense side of the ball, but he's probably going to still hold that responsibility offensively. Maybe he becomes the assistant head coach, or maybe he just also adds the title of running back coach, and he kind of shift around his responsibilities a little bit here. But this guy did work with the guy, and he worked with the offensive line with the Arizona Cardinals. Now, one thing that really stuck out to me here with the tight end position, working with Bruce Arians always had an interesting take on the tight end position. Here are a couple of the quotes that I found. Arizona Cardinals, this is what he said. He said, "Our tight ends are here to block." He said, "We pay too much money to our wide receivers to throw to tight ends." Now, I think that might be a little harsh in terms of saying, okay, that means Lions aren't going to throw to tight ends, but it does fit in with what we do, and I'll tie that into it in a second here, because I found another quote in 2020 from Bruce Arians, who was the head coach at this time. "We're not throwing 50 times to our tight end," and this was with Gronkowski when he was there as their tight end. They were talking about putting him in different spots. He said, "We're not throwing 50 times to our tight end. That's what the receivers are for." So just that kind of mindset I thought was very interesting, because if you take a look on the right side, look at the amount of targets that they had to tight ends. It was extremely low every season. It was near the bottom every single season in terms of how often they targeted their tight ends. 99, 86, 64, 87. Darren Fells was in there for 2 years, and of course he didn't have a college playing background. He was a basketball player, 6'7", 280 pounds. We had him for a little stint, and he was kind of just specific on what he was used for, and he was also a blocking tight end. There was the fact that the Arizona Cardinals during that stint as well, from 2013 to 2017, also went out and signed Jermaine Gresham to a 4-year, $22 million deal. And there were reporters of Arizona saying that this might be the most overpaid tight end in the NFL, because production-wise, there was some there. Like in 2016, he had 37 receptions for 391, and in 2017, he had 33 receptions for 322. You know, that reminds me of when we signed Jesse James. That was the kind of numbers that, if that, I don't even know if Jesse James was putting up those kind of numbers. I'm not trying to take you back down a bad path, but I'm just saying, okay, it does kind of remind me of that a little bit. We paid the dude some money, and he didn't really do much in the passing game. But Arians kind of just bought into that. Like, that's not going to be what our offense is about. And hey, look, they had one of the top offenses, and they continue to have one of the top offenses when Cliff Kingsbury came in.
And a quick note, the Cardinals traded for Zach Ertz when Cliff Kingsbury was there, and he became like one of the most productive tight ends in Cardinals history, because historically they really never had production out of the tight end position.
Now, those are the PFF rankings at the bottom right there in terms of the offensive line and the massive improvements they made. They were a terrible offensive line, even healthy. That was not injuries. They were a terrible offensive line, and they took big-time improvements as he worked with the offensive linemen. So that's definitely something nice there. But I think it's just that maybe mindset. And now the hope thing is that we don't pay too much to a tight end and not utilize a guy. I don't think that will be the case. Brad, I don't think he's going to do that. But we saw last year when we traded away TJ Hawkinson, you could see the targets, and I can throw the thing up we show up a lot of times. Lions had 43 targets to their tight ends between week 9 through week 18. That would have been 27th most in the National Football League, okay? It would have been very low. The Lions really did not target tight ends often. That didn't mean they weren't part of the offense. They just had a specific role. They were mainly blocking tight ends, that would be utilized for the drags, the flats, the leaks, and in the red zone here and there, a play action. There wasn't a lot of we asked of the tight ends. Every once in a while you get James Mitchell in the slot. But with TJ Hawkinson, he was more of the focus point of the offense, meaning we tried to find matchups with TJ. When TJ left, it wasn't about necessarily finding matchups as much with tight ends, I think, as it was just using them in certain spots.
And what I love about this, you get the sense that everybody's on the page, from Brad to Dan to the entire coaching staff, on how they want this thing to look and how they want to build this. Going back to the trade of TJ Hawkinson and the fact that you were still be able to be impactful, you just kind of adjusted a little bit to how you were built as an offense. And then a hiring like this, if it does fall into that category, it makes tons of sense. And I think that helps you avoid some of those things where you give money to a guy and you don't necessarily utilize him. And it feels like the Lions are all on the same page with this type of move based on what we saw last season and how I kind of anticipated to look going forward. Instead of using a guy like TJ Hawkinson as trying to be your matchup piece, instead those are the receivers, and your tight ends kind of supplement through that.
The benefits that the tight ends coach that he worked alongside, Rick Christophel, who has basically just followed around Bruce Arians back in the 80s and Bay Buccaneers most recently, about having tight ends like that can play in line, is that, you know, they can block first, and at the same time you can get matchups with linebackers. And that's different than using a fullback necessarily, the guys that can play different positions, because now you get a different amount of players in the box. When you put a fullback out there, basically Arians' idea was you got an extra player in the box automatically because you had a fullback on the field. So tight end blocking was kind of first for him, and all the tight ends knew that, and they even took less money to stay there when Bruce Arians was there. And I bring that up because I think that's kind of where the Lions are at. Not to say they won't utilize their tight ends. I think they will. I don't think they'll invest heavily there because that's not how they're building this offense. It may work perfect for what this guy's background is, for what Steve Heiden's background is and what he was around in terms of what we're going to be asking of our tight ends. We're not going to be asking the most complex routes. Now, James Mitchell, his athleticism, there's run after catch ability there, but it's more so like specific times we're going to use them in the passing game, and we're going to need them to be able to block. And pass protection is one of the most important parts there. We need our guys to be able to pass protect because that's big for play action. Bring them out from an inline position and utilize them on play action sets, more so that Y tight end versus the F tight end that we see moving a lot now in the NFL. I think it just kind of makes sense with what the Lions are doing here. You know, you're probably going to get a bigger role for Tanner Inkstrand. He'll probably take on a little bit more of responsibility now that Ben Johnson is back. Maybe when Ben, you know, if he ultimately leaves down the road, I think he could be a definite candidate to take over the offensive coordinator position. But you can also start to potentially prepare him for that a little bit if that's the route that he's looking to go, because he's done it before, with adding more responsibilities or different responsibilities, you know, this next coming season, maybe a running back responsibility, getting him back into that department once again here. Ultimately, you feel really good about him within and working with every positional group basically within this offense, because he's also been a quarterback's coach and receivers and all of those things. So that's kind of my thoughts here on this hire of Steve Heiden. Those are the Lions' two most recent hirings that they have announced. Hopefully that made sense. I'm sure it was a little bit all over the place, but if there is more news, of course, we're going to break it down and discuss those. Again, I plan on being live tomorrow for the Senior Bowl. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.